In this lesson, we're continuing our discussion of relevance, and specifically we want to focus on public policy exclusions of potentially relevant evidence under Rules 407 through 411 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. So essentially what's going on here with all of these different types of evidence that you see up here on the board is that these types of evidence involve activities from a societal perspective, public policy reasons that we do not want to discourage, right? These all involve activities that from a societal perspective, we do not want to discourage, right? We don't want somebody to not take subsequent remedial measures out of fear that that evidence could be used against them in court, right? When we're thinking about subsequent remedial measures, we're thinking about making some sort of condition safer, right? After an injury occurs. Once an injury occurs and somebody goes out there and tries to make that condition safer, we don't want somebody to be discouraged from trying to make a condition safer out of fear that that evidence could be used against them to prove negligence. Right, and that's the thread with all of these public policy exclusions. We have 408, which is compromise offers and settlement negotiations, right? We don't want people to not enter into a settlement negotiation out of fear that statements they make during the settlement negotiation could be used against them to prove or disprove the validity of a claim or the amount of the claim, right? Same deal with 409 and medical offers, offers to pay medical expenses, right? We don't want somebody to be discouraged from offering to pay for the medical expenses of another person out of fear that that could be used as evidence to prove liability for the injury, right? 410, same idea as 408 with plea deals and the plea bargaining process. We don't want a criminal defendant to not enter into a plea bargain because he's afraid that that evidence could be used against him in court. Obviously, same idea with liability insurance under Rule 411. We don't want somebody to not get liability insurance out of fear that that could be used as evidence against them to prove negligence or culpable conduct, right? So that's the thread with these public policy exclusions. These all involve activity that we do not want to discourage. It's why we have these rules. So the way to understand this on an evidence fact pattern, right? We're thinking about our actual analysis is number one, we want to really make sure we understand exactly the fact patterns that trigger these rules. You know, what triggers the rule? And then from there, to me, that's almost the hard part. The rest is almost just memorization, right? Then we'll find that, okay, once we identify that this rule is triggered, we know in some situations, right, as we have laid out in this table, it'll be not admissible, and in some situations it will be admissible, right? So, and it'll all come down to why are we introducing this evidence? If we're introducing this evidence to prove anything you see in these columns, that's generally going to be not admissible. But if it's for any other purpose, right, then generally it's going to be admissible. So we'll talk about a lot of examples here and running them all through one by one though, right? But that's the flow. Number one is are these rules triggered? Do we have a fact pattern that triggers this rule? We really want to define what these pieces of evidence actually look like. And then basically from there, it's just memorizing this table. You can't offer this evidence to prove what's in this column. Again, if you're offering it to prove something else that's not in this column, which we'll talk about in this column, right, then it's generally going to be admissible, right? So anyways though, we can jump into it starting with Rule 407 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, which is going to be subsequent remedial measures. So important to realize when we're defining what is a subsequent remedial measure, the process that has to happen here is number one, we need an injury. And then a party, after that injury has occurred, is doing something, is taking some measure to make the condition that caused that injury safer, right? So this can be a lot of things. It can be big, it can be small. You know, it can be as small as imagine you have a slip and fall case at a grocery store, right? There's some spilt milk in an aisle, a patron in the store slips on the milk, is injured, the store sees this and they go and squeegee away the milk. That is a subsequent remedial measure under 407. We have an injury and a party doing something, taking a measure to make that condition safer, right? It can be as small as a slip and fall and squeegeeing. It could be changing your entire company policy, right? Changing the way you manufacture a process, changing, it could involve firing an employee that caused the harm, right? Anything that you do after an injury to try to make the conditions safer is going to generally be considered a subsequent remedial measure under 407. Now, the key to recognize here is it has to be subsequent to an injury. A lot of times, if there's not an injury or the injury has not occurred yet and some action is taken to make something safer, that's not a subsequent remedial measure, right? If it's post-sale but pre-injury that the remedial measure happens, that does not trigger 407. It has to be after the injury occurs. Okay, so when we're defining what fact pattern triggers 407, we need to see, number one, an injury, and then after the injury, some sort of measure is taken to make that condition safer. That's a subsequent remedial measure. And evidence of subsequent remedial measures are not admissible to prove negligence, culpable conduct, a defect in the product or design, or a need for warning or instructions. So if we have a subsequent remedial measure under 407, our general rule is you can't introduce that to prove negligence or culpable conduct. So in that slip and fall case, right, if we have somebody squeegeeing away the milk after an injury, you can't introduce evidence of that employee squeegeeing that milk away to prove that the store was negligent, right? You're not going to be able to do that. Now, when can you introduce subsequent remedial measures under Rule 407? Well, you can introduce evidence of subsequent remedial measures to prove ownership, control, or the feasibility of precautionary measures if disputed, or to impeach a witness, or for any other purpose, right? It's important to recognize that with the flow of this analysis, with all of these, the general rule is if you're not offering the evidence to prove what's in this column, you're introducing it for any other purpose, it's generally going to be admissible, right? So the rules really lay out a lot of examples, but the main idea is if it's for any other purpose than to prove what's all in these columns, generally the rule is that it's admissible. So the big one here is going to be impeachment and to prove ownership, control, or the feasibility of precautionary measures if disputed. So we can start with impeachment, right? The idea here would be you can imagine, and it doesn't really matter what the actual accident or harm is, but just say that it's a manufacturer of a product, right? And then someone who buys this product is seriously injured. So the CEO, after the injury, writes a memo to the whole company saying, hey, look, the way that we were manufacturing this product was really dangerous. We're going to have to change everything. The whole process is changing, X, Y, Z, and sends this memo out to all the employees. Well, if they get to court later, right, and that CEO takes the stand and he says, oh no, the way that we were manufacturing that good was 100% safe. That had no dangerous propensity. This was a freak accident. We were doing everything 100% safe. Well, that's a direct contradiction to the memo that he sent to all of his employees. So you can't introduce that memo, that subsequent remedial measure, evidence of that subsequent remedial measure to prove negligence or culpable conduct, but you can introduce it to attack this witness's credibility. Hey, look, his statement was this. Now it's this. He's changed his story, right? We're attacking his credibility as a witness. We're not offering it to prove negligence or culpable conduct. You're allowed to do that under 407. Right now, also, if any of these items are disputed, ownership, control, or the feasibility of precautionary measures, then the evidence of the subsequent remedial measure is generally going to be admissible under 407. So the classic fact pattern here is imagine that you have a private construction company that's doing a construction project on a public state highway, right? And let's say that there's an accident resulting from the construction which causes injury. So after this accident happens, the construction company goes out there and puts a big warning sign up on the road. They put down a bunch of cones and a big warning sign so that to prevent future accidents like this one from occurring. So if they get to court, that evidence of putting up the cones and putting up the big warning sign is all not admissible to prove that the construction company was negligent. You can't do that, right? But let's say that the defense gets up there, the construction company gets up there, and they argue that, hey, look, we had no ownership or control over this state highway. This isn't our fault. We have no ownership or control over a public state highway. Right? That's not our fault. We're sorry this happened, but you got the wrong defendant. We have no control over a public state highway. Well, at that point, then the plaintiff could introduce evidence of them taking all of these subsequent remedial measures to say, well, you had some level of control, right? You were able to go out there and put up all these cones, this warning sign, do all this stuff. So obviously you have some control over the state highway, and they would be allowed to do that because now ownership or control is in dispute. So they can't introduce the subsequent remedial measures to prove that the construction company was negligent, but they could introduce it to prove that they had some control over the highway if the defendant disputes that, right? Also, we have the same idea here with the feasibility of precautionary measures. Imagine that the defendant gets up there and says, look, there was no way we could have put cones up or put this warning sign up. There was no space on the highway, right? The construction project was so close to the traffic, whatever. We couldn't put up, it was completely not feasible for us to put up these cones or warning signs, whatever. Right, well, in that case, of course, then, if they open the door like that, the plaintiff could introduce evidence and say, well, obviously it was somewhat feasible because you went out there after the accident happened and you did put up the cones and you did, put up this warning sign. So there was some feasibility there at least, right? So if the defendant's going to dispute that, then it can come in under 407. Right, so the key here with subsequent remedial measures and the pattern you should kind of see is generally it's not admissible evidence of subsequent remedial measures until the defendant does something, disputes something, gets up there and contradicts himself and opens himself up to impeachment, or disputes ownership or control or feasibility, right? Once the defendant starts to do that stuff, then the plaintiff could come in and introduce it, right? That's generally how you see it come in under 407. We're thinking about subsequent remedial measures, but you can't introduce it to prove negligence. You can't say, hey, look, because you took this subsequent remedial measures, obviously you were negligent, right? That's not going to fly. It's only if it's for some other purpose. Now, what's important to note here with 407 and what will be the case for all of these rules is, remember, in our first video, we said that the nature of an evidence fact pattern or the nature of an evidence analysis is like getting over hurdles, right? So just because you get over 407, that doesn't mean that that evidence is automatically coming into court. Even if the plaintiff can introduce or say that he's introducing the subsequent remedial measure to impeach the witness or to prove ownership or control or for some other purpose, right? Well, that's going to get over the 407 hurdle, but that doesn't mean that that evidence is going to be automatically admitted into court, right? We would still, at minimum, want to do a 403 balancing test, right? So it got over the 407 hurdle, but anytime we're dealing with things like public policy, societal concerns, we always want to then run through a 403 balancing test, which remember we already talked about, where we weigh the probative value of the evidence against the danger of unfair prejudice. Right? So even if it comes in under 407 or it gets over the 407 hurdle, doesn't mean it's automatically admitted into court. It just means it got over the 407 hurdle. And we would always want to apply a 403 balancing test to any of these public policy exclusions. Because again, anytime public policy is involved, you want to think about danger of unfair prejudice, so you would run a 403 balancing test. So this evidence could get over the 407 hurdle, but if the judge, which is you, on an evidence fact pattern decides that the probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice, it could still be excluded under 403. So when we say it's admissible, we mean it's admissible under Rule 407. Doesn't mean it's automatically admitted into court. Right? Remember, that's the whole idea of evidence. That's why we started with that. I drew the little track with the hurdles, right? Because it's very important we remember that as we go through all of these different analyses. Just because something gets over one hurdle doesn't mean it's automatically going to be admitted to court. All right, so that's 407. Next we have Rule 408, which deals with compromise offers and statements made during settlement negotiations. So our general rule here is that compromise offers or statements made during settlement negotiations are not admissible to prove or disprove the validity or amount of a disputed claim or to impeach a witness by a prior inconsistent statement, unless, and we have a couple little exceptions there that we'll talk about, right? But let's break down this first part first. So if we're thinking about compromise offers and settlement negotiations, you can't offer compromise offers or statements made during settlement negotiations to prove or disprove the validity or amount of a disputed claim. So what are we talking about here? Well, say that we have a creditor and a debtor. This is where you see this a lot. It doesn't matter what, right? We just have a creditor and a debtor, a creditor and a debtor. And let's say that the creditor thinks or is claiming that the debtor owes him $15,000 and the debtor thinks the amount is only $10,000, right? The operative word here is disputed claim. We have to have a claim in dispute in order to trigger 408. So if this is a settlement negotiation and we're trying to settle this lawsuit, right? The creditor saying, hey, look, you need to pay me $15,000 or I'm going to have to sue you to recover in court. And so now the plaintiff comes and says, hey, let's try to settle this thing. But look, I don't think I actually owe you $15,000. Here's what I think, it's only $10,000. And then there can be some negotiation back and forth. Maybe they reach a settlement, maybe they don't. If they don't reach a settlement, those statements made during that settlement negotiation cannot be admitted to prove or disprove the validity or amount of the claim because it was disputed. Right? But this operative word of a disputed claim is really important because a lot of times an evidence fact pattern will do this, right? So imagine this is the trick you want to look out for. Imagine that we have our creditor and our debtor, and the creditor says to the debtor, look, you owe me $15,000. I'm either going to have to sue you to recover the $15,000 in court, or we can try to work out some sort of settlement here. And the debtor says something like, hey, look, you're absolutely right. I do not dispute this at all. I owe you $15,000. There's no doubt about that. But here's the deal. If we go to court, I know at minimum you're going to have to pay $10,000 in attorney's fees and other legal fees. So how about I just pay you $5,000 today and we call it even? Well, in this case, is 408 triggered? And the answer is going to be no, because we don't have a disputed claim. Here the debtor is saying to the creditor, look, I agree, yeah, I owe you $15,000, right? I don't dispute the claim. I'm just trying to basically, right, what does that smell like, that fact pattern, right? It kind of smells like bad faith or a shakedown, right? You're trying to say, look, you're going to end up spending all this money in legal fees and I know it, so I'm going to use that to my advantage and try to get a lower amount, even though I don't dispute the claim. Right? You're thinking about public policy concerns. We don't want to encourage that type of behavior, which is why this fact of it has to be in dispute to trigger 408 exists. It's to prevent that from happening, where the debtor's going to say, hey, look, you're going to have to pay these legal fees, so I don't dispute that I owe you $15,000, but let's just call it, to avoid this or whatever, I'll pay you $5,000 now. Right? If there's no dispute over the claim or either the validity of the claim or the amount owed in the claim, then 408 is not going to be triggered. So that's a big fact pattern you want to look out for when we're trying to define what actually triggers 408 in compromise offers and settlement negotiations. Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying, and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career, and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.